My name is Matt C. I am the chair of the Austin bid for ICYPAA. We're going to go ahead and get started with today's webinar, which is on how to prevent Zoom bombings. So today, what we're going to go over is several different things that have cropped up in the last couple of weeks of issues that we've had regarding people taking over meetings and quote unquote trolling the meeting and basically overthrowing the meeting with all kinds of different things and different ways that they kind of infiltrate. And so we're going to go over several different things. So we're going to go ahead and get started and go over what we're going to be going over in this webinar today. So we're going to be going over what the problem is. I think and understanding how this works and how Zoom bombing works on the back end is very important. And once you understand that, that kind of helps you as a group figure out what's the best practice, which you're going to use. We're going to be going over several different things in this webinar of different controls, settings, and procedures. The thought is that you're going to take all of this information, hopefully bring it back to your group. And because every group is autonomous and because every group has its own problems and it has its own strengths and it has its own uniqueness, you're going to have to decide as a group what works best for your group. And so that brings us into the second part that we'll go over, which is access versus security. This has been brought up several times. And so the idea behind this is that do you want your meeting to be easily accessible or do you want it to be where you want it to be completely secure? So you can't have complete access and complete security. It's just not how it works. And so finding that happy middle ground for your group and what works best for you is going to be very important. And we're going to be sharing all of the best practices that we've encompassed and we found on our own. We're going to be going over settings. There's several settings inside of this webinar, which we're going to be going over that are basically Zoom dependent on each person's account. I guess a recent update in the past 24 hours, Zoom recently released that every meeting will have a password and will have a waiting room, and it's like automatically enabled. From what I've seen today, because we scheduled this webinar ahead of time and we have other recurring meetings which are scheduled, that has not affected our already scheduled meetings, but some of those settings has kind of changed since we started getting all this material together for this webinar. We're going to be going over in-meeting controls, and so these things are vitally important. And the reason why they're important is that we need to make sure that while we're in the meeting itself, that we have all the control that we need to make sure that nobody overthrows the actual meeting or whatever the case may be, whatever you're doing, whether it's a committee meeting or an online meeting. We're going to assume that most of this is going to be dealing with online meetings. We're going to be going over prevention versus procedure. And so there's different things that you can do ahead of time, which have to deal with the settings and everything else. And you could be better made well aware of what you need to do. And then also have procedures in place for your actual meeting itself. And so we're going to also go over how to deal with trolls in the meeting. And then we're going to do a short Q&A after that. The Q&A is going to be in the chat only. And so please keep the chat free and clear of questions right now. If you want, just write them down. Once we get to that part, we will actually go over each one of those questions and address those to the best of our abilities. And so the other thing, too, is that this webinar is being recorded. It will be made available on our Facebook page and on our website. And we were hoping to get it on YouTube the way that we did our last webinar over Zoom best practices, which we had on the AA Grapevine's website. And so we're going to be going over a couple of different things with that. And I'm going to share the links that I have for that because I've already pre-built a website where all that information is going to go, and I will share that with you. So the first thing that we're going to go over today is the problem. And so we had ran into this, I guess, probably about a week and a half ago. I started getting reports, and there's been several posts on Facebook. Security is obviously a really huge issue with our fellowship. Everybody wants to remain anonymous to the level that they feel comfortable with, and everybody doesn't want things getting out of the meeting. And then on top of that, now we're dealing with the whole issue with Zoom bombing. And so what Zoom bombing is, and it's very good to go over the actual problem itself so we can understand this, because once you understand how these Zoom bombs are carried out, it kind of gives you a better idea of how you want to move forward, because if you don't understand what the actual problem is, you can't really address the solution. And so what Zoom bombing is what we have seen as far as our own meeting, which it's been attempted to been Zoom bombed at our own meeting, which we have on Tuesdays. It's been basically, from what we've seen, younger kids that have gone on and shared graphic information, shared graphic things in the chat, unmuted themselves and said, weird or strange things. And it's obviously that they're just trying to be a distraction to the meeting itself. I'm not going to go into motive or anything like that, but just understanding that how this gets carried out is important. What we've seen, we've done a little bit of investigation on our end, is that these meeting IDs are found on central offices, websites, local area websites. They're probably in some Facebook groups, to be quite honest. We haven't really ran into that and addressed that head on, but if I had to guess, there's probably some of those hanging around in some of those pages where they've infiltrated them, and they're sharing those meeting IDs and passwords to chats. And so they're sharing to online chats where a lot of these people are congregating, and then 30 to 50 people, maybe less than that, will all drove into your meeting all at one time. What they'll do is they'll try to screen share and share graphic content. They'll say racial slurs in the actual chat itself. And there's just a slew of things that they try to do to try to overthrow the meeting and basically be a distraction. So that brings us to ways to protect your meeting ID, and it goes back to the question of access versus security, which we'll go on to right now. So everybody wants this to be available to any alcoholic that is still suffering and needs a meeting, right? That is what our primary purpose is to carry this message to the alcoholic that still suffers. With that, you want to make sure that you have this in a place that's readily available. I'm not telling anybody right now that they shouldn't be posting their meeting ID on their intergroup or central office website or any other place. What I'm basically explaining to you is this is how they find them, right? And so if you post that in the password really doesn't do you any good. I'm going to be explaining several things today. I'm not going to take a stance or have a strong opinion on it. What I'm going to do is merely present you with the facts and the procedures and the ways that we've gone about doing this and successfully done this. And then also just basically explain some of the reasons why we go about doing it that way. And then from there, you can kind of go ahead and take whatever you want and leave the rest. So you want to have a secure meeting place. And with that just basically is kind of the counterintuitive part of having the access, because the opposite of having the access is being secure. And so having it completely locked down. And so we strongly believe that there's going to be a happy medium where each group's going to have to decide for themselves what works for them. And so we're trial and erroring, testing several things. Some of the things that we even go over today, we don't necessarily do, but they are options available to you. So we want to make sure that we give you every single, known means that we have. That's a setting or a procedure. So these are the different settings that we're going to go over. Screen share being one of the most important ones, because it's the easiest one that you can kind of get past by just turning it off, where participants can't share their screen. Annotation is whenever participants or host members can actually go on and draw on their board. Whiteboards are pretty similar to that. Rejoin settings, so if you remove somebody, they can't rejoin back into the meeting. Co-host, and how do you make that available, which we'll go in later with the meeting controls. Virtual background, which we'll kind of leave for you to decide for each one of your groups whether or not that's something you want to turn off or on. Passwords and unique IDs, and waiting room. And so these are all important settings that we found were probably the cream of the crop. And so we'll go into settings. So I'm going to make this presentation available to you so you can always go back and do it. And so you've logged into your Zoom account. And I want to say that the easiest way to do this is going to be on a laptop computer. I know that you can access a lot of this on your phone as well, but for this portion of it, we're going to show you how to do it from a laptop just to keep things simple. So you would go ahead and click My Account if you're logged in. From there, you're going to go ahead and go into Settings. And then this is going to take you to the slew of all the settings that we were just going over. And so one of the things, if you have a hard time finding it, because there's a long page of different settings that you can go to, I usually hit Control F and do a quick search. And so if I wanted to find screen share, I would just do Control F on that page and do a quick basically a little quick search to find this. The way that we have ours set up is that the host is the only one that can screen share. And so that also includes co-host. So if I made Connor, which today Connor is a co-host, if I made him available to be a co-host and he accepts it, he has all the same abilities as a host, and so with that, it's important to have co-host in your meeting just to kind of help control the crowd. I would say anybody who's a trusted servant in your home group, if they know how to use Zoom and they kind of understand the procedures behind it, they should be a co-host. It makes things easier when you're operating the meeting. From that point, they kind of just need to go through and also kind of know what their role is as the co-host, because in the way that we're doing it is one person helps the chairperson and the other co-host kind of help the meeting to make sure that everything runs accordingly. So turning screen share off, I think, is one of those that I think across the board everybody should turn off on the participant level. And so the only way that anybody can share is if they're a co-host or a host. Annotation's another one. It's kind of overlooked. If somebody has this to where participants can do it, they could easily draw different profanities or graphic content on the actual screen and just draw it. That's one of the things that we've seen them do. This is an easy setting to turn off. With that, if you're turning settings on and off, if looks like this, that means it's turned off. So that would be one. Whiteboard's another one. It's right below it. And that's another one that you can turn off. So one of the greatest features that we have dealing with Zoom bombing is removing participants. Somebody's obviously a troll. They end up into your meeting. They're trying to Zoom bomb your meeting. If you remove that person, what it's going to do is it's going to make it to where that person on that particular Zoom account that's logged into that email cannot get back into that meeting. If you have this selected right here, what happens is they could just rejoin. So it kind of prevents the problem. And so it blocks them from that meeting ID and joining. And there's another slew of settings that we won't get into that kind of goes into that, dealing with participant information and stuff like that. But from what we understand and what we've been told by Zoom is basically that would remove them rejoining under that Zoom account. Obviously, if they had another Zoom account, they could do that. We've also seen that there's usual suspects whenever it comes to Zoom bombing. One person that we found in our Tuesday night meeting was in a meeting in Boston, was in two meetings here in Austin as well, other than our meeting. And they were also in another meeting somewhere else. I can't remember where. And so they were under the same participant name. And it was easy to point out they spelt it the exact same way. And so there's usual suspects when it comes to this. So if you remove them, it's your best bet to try to remove them. One of the other things that I will cover over that real quick, and we'll go ahead and go on with the rest of the presentation, is that we've seen them come in and do something real quick and leave before they get removed because they know that once they get removed, they can't get back in. So that's another thing. So you have to act quick. Once you know that they are, in fact, trying to Zoom bomb your meeting, what's going to end up happening is from that point, you're going to want to go through and try to remove them as quick as possible. This is the co-host setting. And so with the co-host setting, we turn this on. You can make several people in your meeting a co-host. There's no reason why you wouldn't want to do that, to have basically a field of people that are in your meeting to help you control that meeting, especially whenever you're dealing with a 100-person plus meeting. Ours average around 100 to 120 people each week. We're planning a virtual young people's conference right now where we're planning on to have about 1,000 people. And so if you think of things on that kind of scale and the way that your meeting is set up, you want to make sure you have enough people in there to help you. It's kind of like just having home group members that show up and open up the doors early for your home group. They're responsible members that help set up and clean. They could even be service positions if you wanted to make them, because obviously we don't have coffee chairs right now. And so that's just an idea. We turn co-host on with our settings. And so we make people co-host during the meetings that we held, just to make sure that we can control people and remove people. And also if there's any type of help that needs in the meeting, they're just there and they have all the controls of the host. Virtual background, that's another one. I love virtual background, but that's another thing that you're going to have to choose whether or not you want to have this on or off. I'll tell you that this is another thing, is that they'll use the virtual background. They'll put an explicit or graphic picture behind them. And that's another way that they infiltrate it. It's kind of like screen sharing. And so this is another thing that you have to, decide as a group for yourself. Obviously, it's fun to have a virtual background. It's fun to have different things and controls in the meeting. But once they become used as tools to be used against your meeting to try to take it down, you have to assess whether or not you want to use it. And this is one of them. We currently don't have this turned off right now. It is one of those things that we'll continue to assess this. And I guess as home groups and other committees where these things are happening, you're going to want to make sure that you're just assessing the situation if you need to. If you need to do a bi-weekly group conscience really quick to see how things are going, if maybe you need to change your format, everybody needs to be on the same page on how this needs to operate. And these are unprecedented times that we live in right now. And so right now is one of the weirdest times for us as members of Alcoholics Anonymous that we have to adapt using virtual meetings. And so a generated ID versus personal ID. And so an automatically generated ID is basically like a unique ID. I use them for breakout sessions and things like that. I'd say pretty much everything outside of our Tuesday meeting at this point is a randomly generated ID that it's not every week that you do it. I would say for the most part, everything on our personal ID is something that is a reoccurring thing that doesn't change. Take, for instance, our Tuesday online meeting. That meeting itself is a meeting that doesn't change. It's kind of like an address to a home group, and we know that the home group is at this clubhouse, this church, this meeting space. If we change that and we don't tell anybody, then that kind of creates an access issue that maybe that person doesn't have a way to find out where it is. And it's kind of hard to keep up with the slew of information with everything changing. And so that was brought up here recently in our home group. Do we want to change our personal ID? And what was discussed, and it hasn't been fully decided, but from what it seems is that the general consensus is we don't want to change it currently because then people would lack access to get to the meeting. And I'm a firm believer, and this is just my personal opinion, that we should find ways to adapt and basically not necessarily fight, but prevent these things from happening in the meeting, And I think that there's a slew of things that we can do. It's not going to completely get rid of the problem, but I think that most of these things will keep it to where you're fully operational and with with the least amount of interruptions. That's what you want. So that's kind of up to you whether or not you want to do randomly generated IDs or if you want to do personal IDs. And so enabling passwords, as I mentioned earlier, now Zoom requires a password with every single meeting. And from what I've seen, I tried to schedule one today. It wouldn't let me take it off. It wasn't able to be overridden in the system. And so I don't know if they're going to change this, if this is this new standard, but Zoom's been coming under heavy attack. So with that, at this point, this is kind of irrelevant because they all require passwords. I will say this about the password. You can put an alpha or numeric password for your meeting. So you could change that to a word or a catchphrase or something that has letters and numbers or something that's very specific to your meeting, you know? You could even go as far as put what was the address, the numeric address of your last meeting's place, and then that's a secret that only people know and you don't have to post it online. I know that one thing came up with passwords in another meeting that is really truly my physical home group, and we're trying to go online, was whether or not to give the password out. And that is one way to do it, is that you just don't give the password out and you leave a contact information. But then you go back to the accessibility issue that we want to be easily accessible from anybody concerned with a drinking problem. And so again, this is kind of up to you how you want to give out the password in your group, and you're going to have to decide as a group conscience on how you want to carry out doing that. So waiting room, this is another setting that I believe is now standard. And it's funny, all this changed like in 24 hours, and now we're kind of waiting rooms are pretty much standard. We didn't have one for this meeting because I scheduled it beforehand, so I'm assuming the password and the waiting room weren't in it. But I scheduled a meeting earlier and I couldn't turn the waiting room off. So I'll go into how to control the waiting room. Basically, what it is if you want to think of it, you're going to a conference. You can't get into the main conference place until a certain time. The person at the door lets you in, or if you're at maybe a festival or something like that, you're in line and they're basically looking at your tickets, but they don't let you in yet. You're letting each person in each way, or you could admit everybody into the meeting. It's kind of up to you. You could screen people as they come if you want, like each person, and welcome them to your meeting if you wanted to. There's a lot of different ways to do it. I imagine how you operate with your waiting room is going to be how big your meeting is, and obviously other several factors as well, but how big your meeting it gets. I know there's a meeting on the West Coast that I know somebody mentioned it. I'm going to try to make it there this week. It's a speaker meeting, and they get almost 980 participants each week. So that kind of meeting like that probably would be hard to one by one let everybody in. We'd be waiting all night to try to get in. So this is another thing, as with the rest of the controls that I'm going over, is something that you need to do and look at and assess and see if this is something, how you're going to go through and use this feature. Okay, perfect. So let's go ahead and get into meeting controls. So I'm going to go over some basic functions in Zoom. Some of these you may not know, some of them you may know. I think the way that I'm approaching any of these webinars that I've done, I'm approaching this as if I feel like you know nothing about this subject. So I want to make sure that I don't assume that you know something, so I don't go over anything that you don't know. So some of these are basic features, and some of them are a little bit more advanced. I'm trying to start with some of the basic ones first and working our way up to the more advanced features. And on each one, if it was available, I have mobile versions of the controls and I have desktop versions of the controls. So I'm going to go over both of them. A lot of these were covered in our first webinar that we had a few weeks ago, and it was, a very good webinar, which I will post that information as well. If anybody missed that one, it's on our website as well. And so let's go ahead and get started and look at these. So one of the most important features in Zoom, mute and unmute. One of the things that's wildly different than going to any kind of home group in a physical setting. I cannot press a button and mute you in the home group, even though I'm sure some of us would love to do that. So with this feature, this is the mobile version. If you are in and you are a host of a meeting, whenever you click over a participant, you get all of these different options. And so you can mute audio or unmute audio or rename their name. And this is actually the view if you were actually in the meeting as a attendee and not a participant. There's a few other ones that I'll show you later as a host. But if you were an attendee, this is what it would look like. I had to kind of come up with these myself, so it wasn't exactly perfect, but you get the idea. You just can go over there and click on top of the participant and click mute, and then they would be muted. So this is the desktop version, very similar. Click over the participant, and then you have the option to mute them. You also can turn off their video if you wanted to. So unmute, same thing, very basic controls. And so that is a very important control that we have in Zoom. And so the other one is an also very important feature is raise and unraise hands. So in our meeting, we have it to where we have a 15 to 20 minute speaker, and then they bring the topic, which is the step or the tradition of the month. From that point, what happens is we call on people who want to share, and we ask if anybody wants to share, please raise your hand, and we explain how to raise your hand in Zoom. And so from that point, what they do is they go through and they raise their hand, and we lower their hand after we unmute them, or it doesn't really matter if you unmute them and then wait until they're finished to share to lower their hand, because it kind of drops into the list. And so that's the basic features. That's what we found to be a very important feature in Zoom that we use every single meeting. And so once you click over a participant, you could raise your hand. Similarly, if you're a host in this, you could actually go through and tell them to lower their hand. You have other controls. And so once you want to lower your hand, you can go ahead and click over your name again and lower your hand. Same thing, whenever you do this, the hand will raise up right here on the window. Once they do that, then you just actually click right here to lower hand, and it will give you that option to lower their hand. Both very important features. Some of these features that we're about to go into right now, I didn't know that you can do in the mobile version, but you can. And so if you're actually on the this page itself, what you're going to do is you're going to click the meeting settings. What you do is you go to mute all and go to the participant. From there, you're going to disallow participants to unmute themselves. And so from that point, what happens is once this is unchecked right here and you're in your meeting, once you do it, they cannot unmute themselves. And so that's an important control that you have. And so whenever you do this, what happens is, and actually I believe this is actually flip-flop. This is just mute all right here. And once you do that, this comes up right here. And so once you mute all, you can actually do this. So just ignore this one right here. And so once you do that, they can't unmute themselves unless you unmute them. And then this is the same thing right here. This will show up right here where we'll say disallow once you click mute all. There's also a way to do it on more. And once you do that, it will actually show up and actually allow you to do that. And that's the setting. So disallow chat only to host. This is a setting that we have set up on ours. The way that we have it set up is we have it to where only the host can get the chats. And so this is something that you'll kind of have to assess on your own. And so it's one of these things that we've seen them do all kinds of crazy things in the chat where they're very abrasive and just saying very rude, obnoxious things. And so instead of having it to where it's a problem and a distraction for the speaker or other attendees, we have it to where we turn it off during the meeting. And I think before the meeting we have it on unless things get bad before the meeting, obviously. And so if you're on a mobile and you click more and you click meeting settings, this will take you to a slew of other meeting settings. And so this is where you would select. And once you do that, it gives you this pop-up right here where you can click host only. And so the reason why we have it set up like that is because if they ever have an issue in the meeting or they need something, or maybe there's like, let's say you have like a newcomer liaison that will give a meeting list to somebody who is a host of the meeting can actually go through and send them that list. And so you don't want it to where they can't chat at all, because I believe that you're going to need to go through and actually, we're going to need them to go through and actually message somebody who is a host. And if anything comes up that's an issue of safety, you want somebody to know that. Or if somebody's doing something in the meeting or you're muted and you don't know you're muted, you don't want to have complete no type of contact between your participants and your host. And so that's the reason why we have that set up this way. All right. So ultimately, this is also the same type of functions on the desktop version to turn this off. So on the actual chat itself, once you're logged into your account and you click this right here, this will give you the option to go through and click host only. And so that will basically give you the same setting that we went over just earlier. So this is basically one of those important functions that you want to be as preventative as possible. You don't want to have any type of issues during the meeting where people are being distraction. What I've seen is that I just rather get rid of all the problems ahead of time. That way we don't have any type of issues going forward in the meeting, and we can just run as smoothly as possible. On the flip side of that, once you disallow some of these things, it does put you in a position where you have issues where you don't have the same type of meeting place that you do whenever you had a physical meeting. So it is a pros and cons type of deal whenever you're dealing with the chat or any of these settings. So here is the other one of the other features that's very important, which is assigning a co-host. So today I made, you could either make them a host or a co-host. Usually if you're logged in as a host, there's really no reason to make somebody the host unless you're leaving and you know that you're leaving and you're basically going through to basically, you're not going to be in the meeting later and you want to make sure somebody else is host. And so we assign several co-hosts during the actual meeting itself to where we can use those people to remove people or ask questions. If anybody asks questions during the chat, they can help with that, and also basically helping to moderate the whole meeting itself. It's pretty easy. You just click over a participant if you're actually hosting inside of uh, the actual meeting itself. And once you do that, it gives you all these options. And so this is what I was talking about earlier. And so once you do that, you can assign co-host. You can see it has them muted right here, so you can click on mute. And that was what was missing on the other slide. And I'll fix that. And so once you make them a co-host, they have all the same functionality as you as being a host. If you're on a desktop, it's the same thing. If you click more, and from that point, you can go through and actually make them a co-host. And so it's the same type of functions. Most of the things that you find in the actual Zoom app that you use on your phone versus the desktop version are very similar. There are a few things where the meeting settings are that were really, they're more of a pain to get to than if you use a desktop. I suggest everybody use a desktop whenever you're doing this because it's just so much easier to control the meeting and go through, and it's just a better experience. And so that's assigning co-host. Removing participants. And like I was saying earlier, this is a very important function of the controls that you have in Zoom. I believe that I accidentally clicked rename, it should be remove. It's right here. And so from right there, you just click remove. And that's the same function. If you click the participant and then you click remove, it actually allows you to go through and remove the participant. And so same thing with the desktop version. If you click over to participant, it has the option to go through and remove them if you click more. And so that's basically the same two functions of going through and removing a participant. All right. Like I mentioned earlier, if you remove them and you don't have the setting on earlier, it will not allow them to rejoin. It's pretty important that you have that type of functionality. So with waiting room, if you have the settings that I had earlier enabled, this allows you to enable waiting room in your actual meeting. Like I was mentioning earlier, it's one of those things that I think this is going to be a non-issue, I guess, for the time being, because it's already going to be pre-enabled. And so this is what it looks like once you actually have somebody that joins. So it pops up on the top of your screen if you're on a mobile device, and if you're on a desktop, it pops up on the top of your participant window, and you could either admit one participant or you could admit all. And so you can kind of go down the line, see if who's all coming in. I guess that brings us back to the other point of access versus security. Um, that's one of those things. It's like, how are you going to screen people in the meeting if you're going to use this feature? It's kind of left up to you. Another thing is that the waiting room is a great feature if you don't want people to get back into the actual meeting itself right away. Like you want some time to maybe prep and get everybody that are co-host, go over the meeting format, and you don't want to do that in front of people. And so you go through your participant window and admit all the home group members until maybe it's 30 minutes before the meeting or an hour before the meeting. And I don't know how your meeting's set up, but I know people join about an hour before for ours, kind of how my home group is physically here in Austin. And so you maybe want some time to go through and enable this and wait till and admit all the people that are participants, because you kind of want to wait to prep and make sure everybody's on the same page. Or maybe you're having a group conscious before the meeting and you don't want to admit all those people that are not home group members in. And then once the meeting starts, you kind of go through and you have some time before where you could fellowship and talk. And so that is the waiting room. And so lock meeting. And so this is also a very important feature that we have in Zoom. And so this feature if you enable this feature, what will happen is nobody else will be able to get into the meeting. And so it basically locks it. We're going to go over some slides later that kind of go over, what can happen to your meeting and what our experience have been and where you may need to use this. We haven't had to use this yet. I don't want to say that we'll never have to, but I can see why some meetings would want to do that. So if you're on a mobile, what you're going to do is you're going to click these three dots right here. You're going to go to meeting settings, and then you're going to enable lock meeting. And what that will do again is that will lock everybody out of the actual meeting itself. And so if you're having an issue where they're just coming in 30, 40, 50 people at a time, which that's what we've seen, it's kind of crazy. You'll be looking at your participant, you'll have 100 people, and then you'll look down and then you'll look back up and you'll see you have 140 people in your meeting. That's a good indicator that you're being Zoom bombed. It's one of the litmus tests that I've seen. And so from that point, once you see that, you could theoretically lock the meeting so nobody else can come in, remove all the people that are issues, and then that way they won't be able to get back in right away. I've seen them come in and out, in and out, in and out, and it's not that we're removing every single one of them. It's that they're doing that to where they won't get removed. And they're just being a nuisance, hurry up and getting out, and then coming back in. And so the lock feature is a very important feature if you want to use this. The other option is on the desktop view, and if you click more, you can click lock meeting. And so it's kind of all the same functions to disallow people from unmuting themselves. That's the same button. Right under that is lock meeting. This is also a great feature, lower all hands. If you had a bunch of people raise their hand, instead of going through one by one, you can click lower all hands. Great feature as well. Like I said, lock meeting is one of those things that maybe that's something that you want to implement at your meeting. If you know that you're being Zoom bombed, lock the meeting until you get it under control. It is one of those things that once they post that link in that chat, from what we've seen, I'm sure there's other ways that they're doing it, but once they do that and everybody has access to it and they're just coming in droves to come into your meeting, this will kind of prevent some of that and give you some time to catch your breath and maybe control the meeting. So this brings us to towards the end of the webinar of prevention versus procedure. And so uh, obviously all of these settings are meant to help prevent this from happening to where it's an issue. I will go on and say this. Uh, it's it's going to be pretty much impossible unless you hide your meeting ID and it's only circulated internally to prevent this from happening the way that we've seen it happen, unless there's going to be some kind of crazy law that comes out that really makes this something that these people don't want to do this. It's kind of unfathomable to think that this is just going to go away overnight. So the prevention part of it is setting your meeting up to where it won't happen to a way that you have to end the meeting before it needs to be ended, and before the person that's in there that needs to hear that message of Alcoholics Anonymous, where they don't get to hear that message. I was thinking about this the other day. I couldn't imagine getting sober right now in this time, and so all of these things are very important, and it is a very great duty that we carry on for the people that are actually making these meetings possible. Because if you were new and you didn't know where to go and all these meetings shut down because we just gave in and we let the Zoom bombers win, where would we be? And so all these tools are meant for how you could set your meeting up for success to prevent it as much as possible. And so it's going to happen. It's what you're going to do to actually prevent it from happening. And then the second part, what is the procedure? Once you know that this is happening right now into your home group, one of the things is what are you going to do from there to make sure that you're doing everything that you can within your power to remove them as quick as possible, and then also eliminate anything that would be a disturbance from somebody hearing the message. So one of the things that came up for us was that we were having an issue with people just randomly turning their screens on, and it would be something crazy. And so we were like, we're not going to call anybody tonight that doesn't have their screen on, and that kind of eliminates the issue of somebody that maybe don't want to have their face on Zoom. So you have to go through all of these things and try to figure out what's going to work best for your meeting and also come to a group conscience. So there's different things with that you're going to come up with procedures. Like if we come down and under lockdown and 30 people come and they hit our meeting, we're going to lock down the meeting. We'll pause for a second to kind of regroup, and then from there we're going to carry out the rest of the meeting. I think it's very, very possible, especially once you have all these settings in place. At that point, once they can't chat in the chat, they can't unmute themselves. You're going to run into a situation where they can't do anything, and they're just messaging the host, spamming you with all kinds of. I got all kinds of racial slurs and all these different things sent to me. And what we ended up doing was we kind of got through that. Once we acknowledged all the trolls, we started going through, and we had a whole team of people that went through and removed all of them. The other part that we did on the procedure side was we went through and we were looking through screens and making sure nobody was sharing graphic content on their screen, because there were some, and we were removing those people as well. And so you could have things on the procedure side that at the beginning of the meeting you say, please introduce yourself with first name and last initial. Please cloak yourself with enough, anonymity that you want as a member. Say all kinds of different things like that because people are scared about security. And then also talk about that you have a zero tolerance for these things and list them off, and say that you will be removed from the meeting if you do these things. And that kind of leaves you and puts you in the clear that you're not just removing people arbitrarily. If they do certain things, that they will be removed from the meeting. And so those are the type of procedures that we've been talking about. I think last week I'd sent to a group chat that we have for all our home group members for our online meeting. I said, we're going to get hit tonight, and it's up to us to kind of be prepared for that, and I kind of knew it. I'd been seeing all these other home groups, and because me and a few of the other home group members had sat down and said, this is what we're going to do. We came up with a game plan procedure wise that worked for our meeting. And we also had everything locked down on the prevention side, that we prevented as much as we could any type of a disturbance. So how to deal with trolls whenever they're actually in your meeting. And I think I've gone over a good bit of that. And I'll say there's the other part of it. We had somebody last week that the second that they shared and they started laughing and the things that came out of their mouth, we knew that they were a troll, and we didn't have to second guess it. And they were saying some things that could have been very offensive to somebody if they were there. And we went through and we removed them immediately. We knew they were a troll, and it's very easy to tell. They're usually it's one of those things. Once you see enough of it, you understand their behavior patterns and the way that they act. One of the things that I started to implement after every person that shared, I was almost ready if they would start blurting out something that was offensive and they come to be that they were a Zoom bomber, I would have it right over the remove person, remove participant. And so I was ready if I needed to remove that person and limit as much distraction of the meeting as we could. Ultimately, you want people to be able to share. You want people to be able to participate, and you want people to be able to hear the message of Alcoholics Anonymous. And so you have to come up with these different procedures and plans in place that how you're going to deal with it in the meeting. I mentioned earlier about the meeting lock. You know, whenever you're coming under fire and you're obviously that's what you're dealing with. I'd imagine if you're like 15 minutes in, 20 minutes into a meeting and this is happening, if you lock down the meeting and they can't get in, what's going to happen is they're going to realize they can't get in because they've been locked out and they're going to go on to the next meeting ID. And so with that, you can come up with plans and procedures in place on how to deal with these trolls once they get into your meeting. You know, and I call them trolls, you know, just because that's an easy way to call a Zoom bomber or anybody who's coming to fake to get into something and cause a disturbance. And so one of the things that we were also doing is making sure that the chat's disabled at a certain time in the meeting, making sure all the participants are muted and they can't unmute themselves, checking our settings before the meeting, you know, to make sure that we prevent all these things. And then once they happen, we have all of our co-hosts. We have one person that's helping the chairperson unmute people and then also go through the meeting format of you know, basically doing participants. And then we have probably 2 to 3 people that are in the meeting themselves looking at screens, making sure everything's locked down and everything's secure. And they're going through and removing people that need to be removed from the actual meeting itself.